great to come along. Thanks so much. I got one copy of the book if you want to have a quick browse to see what it's like. It's got nice coloured pictures in it as well as anything else. So it's really a joy to come along and to share some of these ideas with you and very much see how they resonate with you. So I'm going to be fascinated to hear about what you make of it. Because I think that this is not just about a book. It's not just about Blake studies, as it were, not even about Platonism, but I think there is a sort of awakening appetite for some of these ideas in the wider culture. You know, I'm kind of try and straddle those different worlds, and there's something happening, which maybe we could pick up as well. So, and Blake is one very good way of talking about it. That's what I hope to persuade you of, if nothing else, because people love Blake. They've all heard of what it might be to see in a world in a grain of sand, but maybe not a whole lot more. And so it's an opportunity to as Blake said, to pick up the end of the golden string and wind it into a ball and see where it might end up. And what I wanted to do today was sort of frame the discussion around what Owen Barfield actually called the tragedy of romanticism. So let me set that up to start with, and then feed in Blake's response through that. We live in a split world. You can characterize that in all sorts of ways, between the thinking and the feeling, between evidence and the imagination. Blake had a keen analysis of what was beginning to go wrong in the Georgian period, and he blamed it quite a lot, at least, on the figure of Isaac Newton. But his blame is more subtle than first meets the eye, because what Newton achieved was an astonishing feat of the imagination in making this link between what we popularly remember as the dropping of an apple falling according to the same force as the moon turning around the earth. That is not an obvious symmetry to make, and Newton made it and then made it tractable to mathematics. And so astonishing in a way was that in the 17th and 18th century, his presence was keenly felt in all sorts of ways. And people like John Locke, Adam Smith, others went on this great project to spot the laws that might govern anything, from other features in the natural world, to the mind, to governance, to morality. I mean, it's easy to overlook that in Blake's life, two brand new and now dominant modes of doing moral philosophy were born: deontology in Germany, and in London, Jeremy Bentham, utilitarianism, completely eclipsing older ways of thinking about what the good life might be, and all based upon the idea that you can make some kind of abstraction, some kind of generalization, some kind of calculation, in the case of philosophic calculus with Bentham. And that would help us understand ourselves better, the world better, and live better as well. Blake spotted right from the get-go that, take the issue of moral theory, it was going to lead to people being divided. Because what these calculations do is take the living out of the living, if you like. That they take away, say, in moral theory, the imperative upon us to understand ourselves better, and so navigate the love and the hate that flows through us as much through anything else, and instead reduce concerns to issues, and then moreover force you almost to ask yourself, am I for or against? Is this good or bad? Friend or foe? And so you have the totemic issues now of our time, abortion, immigration, in the US, gun control, and it's almost impossible to have a discussion about them because you have to first of all assert which side you're on. And Blake blamed this, as it were, on this extraordinary feat of the imagination that Newton achieved, and then the theological correlate, which was the ascendancy of deism. So the idea that God too is like a divine engineer, brilliantly casting the cosmos in ordered ways that it was up to the human mind to discern. And it at once influenced King George III on this side of the Atlantic, and then Tom Paine on the other side of the Atlantic with the American War of Independence, and of course in the French Revolution as well, causing great aspiration and great horror all at once. And we live, I think, still in that milieu. So romanticism is born almost at the same time as the Enlightenment, as it's also called. And what Barfield spotted, though, was that romanticism, as he puts it, failed to come of age. And this is its tragedy, that it promises a kind of rediscovery of meaning, a new connection, a revived sense that the microcosm inside might mirror the macrocosm in some way. But it was unrooted. It never really developed an epistemology or an ontology. And so what you get instead is a movement that just tries to intensify feeling in order to be a proxy to what you might call knowledge proper. And you see that in language now. So, imaginings, imagine, imaginary means a sort of vague dreaming rather than truth bearing. And even the word romantic, of course, has come to mean a kind of sentimentality or a sort of fanciful hope. Nothing more substantial in many people's minds. And then, as philosophers like Isaiah Berlin have pointed out as well, there's the much darker side, that if you align intense feeling, authenticity, and then political movements together, you get nationalism, you get fundamentalism, you get, I think even actually in the psychological world, which I spend a lot of my time in, and in the spiritual world, programs, practices, offerings, which are really about intensifying the feeling as much as possible. You go on a Hoffman process in a week, it will change your life. And the whole promise is that it will just so overload you with feeling that something's got to give. But quite what and how and so on is then another question. So hedonism, of course, to consumerism, you can look where you like. This unmoored romanticism is at once powerfully at play in our culture as much as the Enlightenment as well. So Barfield was clear, though, and I think Blake shares this too, that this is all at once a preparation for a fuller consciousness. And what's being born is a different sense of the self, is a different kind of awareness of the will, a different notion of freedom. And that is therefore a sort of promise as to why it's worth bearing these contraries, as Blake put it. And that's what I want to sort of move on to now. If you buy the argument that there's been something tragic about the Romantic movement, what to do about that, where to go next? And I think Blake, the Platonist, is a key part of this, is a key element to hold in mind here. So just to affirm the reasons why Blake might be thought a Platonist. He knows, for example, that transcendence is also immanent, hence to see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. He understands too the dynamics of light and of time. So he says, energy is eternal delight. And I think this is not just a romantic flourish. He always uses the word eternal and eternity with a profound awareness of the divine aspect of existence. And so energy for him is not, as Newton would define it, that which does work. Doesn't really matter what work, what that work might be for and so on. Now for Blake, energy always has a kind of telos. It always has a yearning to return to the energy from whence it came. And that's why it's eternal delight. So you have this sense of purpose, even mind and intelligence, that's in the way that Blake uses the word energy. Similarly with time, he writes beautiful phrases about time. One of the best known is the ruins of time build mansions in eternity. And again, you can detect the Platonic debt there with the moving image of time, of eternity and so on. The transcendentals or the transcendent values are his guides. Exuberance is beauty, he says. Not just exuberance is a kick, but exuberance can lead you somewhere as well when you discern the beauty within it. And he deploys notions, of course, such as emanations. His long, I think, greatest poem, Jerusalem, the emanation of the giant Albion. And it's all about how Albion, this sort of every person figure, a country as well as an individual, a sort of state of being and a state of yearning might be reunited with Jerusalem, Albion's emanation, and so know Albion's self in all its greatest fullness once again. I think he's also a Platonist because he was very aware of truth in other traditions. We know that he read the Bhagavad Gita when it was translated into English in 1785. He knew Charles Wilkins. He drew pictures of Brahmins and indeed a portrait of Charles Wilkins as well. And you can detect quite clearly how the Gita informed his own work. So this is perceiving the depth in another tradition so that it enlivens the depth in your own. And often that depth is Neoplatonic in shape. It's quite likely also that he read the Quran. A translator of Ibn Arabi too told me just the other week that she felt pretty certain that some of Ibn Arabi's works were being translated and might have been available in London at the time as well. He also himself states that the ideas of Plato, as he puts it, have been stolen and perverted. I love quoting that to people that put Plato down these days. And he's particularly focusing on how the establishment, the warmongering establishment particularly, as Julia Annas has pointed out, actually, I think she pinpoints it slightly later, but as it were, the British Empire needed a kind of curriculum in which to found the sense that its youth were going to go out, its young men particularly, I suppose, were going to go out and sort of rule the world. And Julia Annas has tracked how the Republic particularly became this kind of manifesto, and so was read as a sort of almost a policy document, which is horrible and shocking, because it always says to me, people don't ever quite read the Republic. They just sort of get the extracts or something. Anyway, Blake spotted this as well and talked about how Plato had been stolen and perverted. And he thinks a lot about body and soul, and would never have fallen for a crude dualism, but rather reflects very beautifully about how the body is the manifestation of the soul, and how the body is the inlet for the soul in this age, and so on. The sense of how these things are actually working together. He's also a Christian Platonist. I think that's really important to assert. In Jerusalem, the Emanation of the Giant Albion, God appears, or the divine Savior appears at the end and dictates the world of this mild song, as Blake puts it, and says, I am in you and you're in me, mutual in love divine. I'm not a God afar off, I'm a brother and a friend. And the incarnation is absolutely central to Blake's mature thinking and feeling about these things. At the end of Jerusalem, the Emanation of the Giant Albion, loss in Jesus, and then Jesus in Jerusalem, they're identified. And all intelligences actually are identified with the divine Logos. When Blake uses the word men, he's not just using the word in a generic sense meaning humanity. He's linking, I think, the root men with mentality. So it's all creatures who have intelligence. And so he'll say each meteoric cloud, each mountain and hill, each grain of sand on the beach in Feltham and so on, they're men seen afar. Everything shares in this divine intelligence in its own way. So he's a Christian Platonist as well. And he pushes back against reductions in notions like, say, law. The laws of nature. Barfield spotted, and Blake would have agreed, that word law comes from the Latin lex. So it's really the spirit of that word lex, law, which Francis Bacon uses, is the general commanding his troops. And so hence, too, the world is kind of commanded by the deistic God. Sort of abstract necessities have been taken into modern science, rather than nomos, which is how Plato would have used it, which mean more, I think, kind of customs and traditions that bring about a communion, an order within the chaos and so on. So much more dynamic and, almost personal sense of nomos. So something about Blake as the Platonist. So, what does he do with that? And here I'm indebted again to Barfield, because I think that one of the things that Blake spotted, I think you can make the case he spotted it explicitly, but certainly it's implicit, is that if in the Platonic texts from the ancient world, from much of the medieval period, inspiration was what the Platonist cultivated in order to have the participation that was the foundation of knowledge and the foundation of any kind of ontology. Blake realized that a different kind of mentality obtained in this new world, the modern world, and it required not so much inspiration as imagination. And roughly the difference there, these things can be parsed in lots of different ways, of course, but roughly the difference is that whereas inspiration is breathed from out within, so when Plato in his early dialogues writes about poetry, it's all about how does the muse seize you. Imagination comes from within and goes out and then makes connections without. And I think that's why for Blake the imagination was so fundamental. It was the new way of knowing. It was the new way of founding a relationship, a participation with the world around us, a new way that truth would be born to us. And so an ontology would be established. And just to give it a bit more of an inflection, hopefully bring it a bit more to life, to use Barfieldian terms which he actually gets from Rudolf Steiner, if in the period from, say, antiquity into the medieval world, what Steiner called an intellectual soul obtained, in the early modern period, and then fully in our period, a consciousness soul, as Steiner calls it, obtains. And the intellectual soul you can characterize as saying that a thought that you had, you could know pretty much directly. It needed discerning, but pretty much directly as a divine thought. Your thoughts, as it were, weren't your own. They were always happening to you. And so in the early church, desert fathers and mothers, they will talk about logoi coming and working out, is it a demon or is it divine, and so on. And I think this is really why Christianity took off so much, actually, was that in the person of Christ, people saw a type for themselves, that the divine and the human had met, the infinite and the finite, the divine, therefore known as the Logos moving in you, seen in the person of Christ. And if you read great texts like the Divine Comedy, in the Paradise, Beatrice guides Dante by developing and deepening and expanding and nuancing his own thoughts and feelings through her smiles, through her music, through her eyes, so that he can enter more and more deeply into the divine presence. Philosophy, even you might say, was not thinking about God or thinking of God. It was thinking God or nature or the cosmos or friendship or virtue, because it was a participation, not an examination. So one of the things you learn if you study these things at all seriously is that the so-called proofs for the existence of God are actually really a kind of meditation or worship, because they're a way of beginning to feel more deeply how your mind might fit the divine mind, and so know God in that way. So this all promises, in Blake's Platonism, a way of understanding how the microcosm and the macrocosm might reconnect, how an epistemology and so on might be established, but through the imagination. And because what happens with the consciousness soul is that the sense that your thoughts might be shared with the divine sort of breaks, it thins and then breaks, so that now it's quite natural for us to think that, my thoughts are my own thoughts, and how the individual, therefore, is born in a much keener sense that we have it now. And I think this is all part of why we were very gripped by notions of identity, whereas in the intellectual soul, it was, as it were, Christ and the individual that was identified. Identity has now come to mean your personal, private identity. And what are you going to make of that? And so identity politics and the sense of being an individual spiritual being rather than knowing your place in the great chain of being. These are now our preoccupations. Again, just to stress, for all the confusion and conflict that this brings about, very evident to us, and Barfield would always be saying, but listen in, there's a new freedom, there's a new kind of will being born in this that will carry us back in a new way. So the Romantics, if Blake is a romantic, other romantics were onto this, and they start to feel it out. And so you have, say, Wordsworth talking about that which is half created and perceived. And you have Coleridge, of course, talking about the imagination and differentiating it from pure fancy, and imagination proper as a sharing in the divine I am. and also talking about we receive but what we give. So that sense of reaching out in order that something might reach back in. But the ontological element, the epistemological element must be secured as well. And I think Blake, who has quite a lot of mythological history in his work, and then also reading Blake through Barfield and Steiner, who explicitly have that, realized that where we've come from is absolutely fundamental to understanding where we might go next. And incidentally, actually, I'm not just putting Blake and Barfield together on a whimsy. Barfield clearly felt that Blake anticipated a lot of what he was trying to write about too. He writes about Blake explicitly spotting how Blake had elements of what Barfield called a final participation, a resolution of these troubles in mind. In some of his fiction, characters get prescribed Blake. There's one character called Vernon who's getting rather lost in a bureaucratic, legalistic kind of world. And he's told to go and spend a couple of years reading nothing but William Blake. And this will redeem all his troubles. And Steiner too said that Blake anticipated what he called spiritual science or anthroposophy, and the significance of spiritual science there, if nothing else, being that it's founded, that it has a kind of systematic ontology within it as well. They liked him, I think, too, because Blake saw the spiritual presences within the natural world, and this is a key, you might say, phenomenological correlate to an epistemology or an ontology being born. Blake famously sees the rising sun not as a golden disc looking a bit like a guinea popping up over the horizon, but as the heavenly host crying, holy, holy, holy. He'll say, the fool sees not the same tree that the wise man sees. And he'll talk about a world in a grain of sand and spiritual beings being present in these things as well. That's always the sort of test case. Where are the angels? Where have the angels gone to? Where is this intelligence that's not just stuck inside my skull and your skull, but is mediated throughout the whole of the natural world, throughout the whole of the cosmos? And Blake had a keen awareness of that. So as to the imagination, I think one of the lines that Blake puts down that is a good one to challenge ourselves as well as perhaps others today is that the imagination is not that something that I might have and you might have and someone like Blake has in much greater measure. No, the imagination has us. And the question is how we collaborate with the imagination. The imagination had Newton, and Newton collaborated with it in a certain kind of way. The imagination has us now, because if it didn't, you wouldn't hear me speaking words. Strictly speaking, in this purely material understanding of the world, I'm not speaking words, I'm putting out vibrations into the air that your eardrum is receiving. Or if it's mediated even more complex online, it's being sort of transformed into some kind of light that's moving down an optic fiber and then coming out the other end, being transformed back into vibrations and images and so on. But of course, we don't hear vibrations, we hear words. We hear, I hope, words that carry meaning, that even as I'm speaking, doing this extraordinary thing of carrying us into a different world that we share, that's not here physically. I think this is the big difference between animal locutions and words proper, as Simon Conway Morris, who's here in Cambridge has spotted. They can be atopographic, doesn't matter where we are, we can be carried into other places and times with these words. And that's because the imagination is always already alive in us. And so it's not a question of whether you have imagination or not, it's a question of how we see that and how we can participate with it. And part of this freedom and new kind of will is a growing self-awareness of that extraordinary divine collaboration that's going on all the time. Blake, he wants to attack as much the philosophy that prevents this awareness, as much as cultivate the awareness. So just to think a little bit about poetry and then an image, which I hope people might be able to see on this card if they're not joining us in person, but it's the famous image of Albion Rose or Glad Day. Come to speak about that in a minute, but think of one of Blake's best known phrases. if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is infinite. And ever since Aldous Huxley used it to name his book, where he explored his trips on mescaline, and the Doors called their group after it, it's been rather associated with kind of peak experiences, sort of exceptions that somehow prove the rule. But I think Blake didn't mean it in that way at all. And Blake's one of these poets where you have to pay attention to absolutely every single word and ask yourself, where's he challenging you? And in this phrase, the doors of perception, I think he's challenging us because he hasn't used the natural metaphor. The natural metaphor would be the windows of perception. You know, our senses, particularly the eyes, are kind of windows through which we perceive the outer world. But what he's saying is that this modern philosophy has turned windows into doors, so that our senses have become these kind of receivers of sense data, as John Locke would have it, that fall onto the tabula rasa of the mind, that then a kind of inner rationality with a little few drips and drops of imagination turn into a kind of model of the world that you then hallucinate. And if you're lucky enough, your hallucinations match more or less the world around you, and maybe even someone else's hallucinations, then you feel like you're falling in love. But of course, you know, premised underneath this is a sense of isolation. We're fundamentally cut off. And that's what doors of perception do. So the philosophy has got to be cleansed. If the doors of perception were cleansed, then we'd know once more the world as it is infinite. We'd see the senses as thresholds, as portals, and our active imagination could engage with the imagination that's all around us in order that could be born a richer perception that both we're giving to and receiving from. This is what Blake's onto. And to look to the image here, he portrays it in this way. You know, no doubt these images can be discussed in all sorts of ways, interpreted in all sorts of ways. But I like to think that what Blake is doing here is drawing on Leonardo's Vitruvian Man, which, you know, you'll know is this image of, again, a male figure, arms outstretched. In Leonardo's case, the legs in a symmetrical form of standing, and then surrounded by the circle and the square. Quite a common image in mystical texts about how the human mind is able to reach over what's effable into the ineffable, to, as it were, love more than it can know, squaring the circle. Dante uses it right at the end of the Paradise. And so Leonardo is using sacred geometry in an age of the intellectual soul where the circular spoke of a quality of being as much as an object. The square spoke of a quality of being, particularly the earth joining with the circular heavens. And so it worked in Leonardo's time as a mystical image of the human capacities. Blake's had to reshift that now because in the consciousness soul era, a lot of those qualities have been lost and they become quantities. You know, so a number speaks now of two being the numeral two, two things, rather than say two-ness. And so I think he resorts, Blake does, to light to get the same kind of communication, because light is one of these words that survived the transition. We still quite spontaneously will talk of the light around us, you know, the light of the dying sun as we're walking in tonight, but also of the light within. I hope you get some sense of, you know, the enlightenment that Blake might bring in these wonderful poetic expressions. And so there's still that quite natural correlate between the external vitality and the inner vitality. So Blake's got that in this image. At once, this is clearly, you know, sort of bit of a study in the spectrum that Newton identified. There's red, the longer wavelength, but there's also blues at the shorter wavelength and the whites and the yellows in the middle there. But clearly it's presented in a way that's not a representation of external light. This is an inner light in the image. And so there's the burst of vitality. And that, I think, is displayed in the way that Blake has shown now this young man, a sort of calm face, the nakedness has become a kind of porosity again, and the legs have moved so that they're almost dancing on the earth, what would have been the square, into the circular light above. But there's even a third element here. It's not just external light and inner light, I think, because the image sort of raises the question, where's this light coming from? It's not quite clear. Is it coming from within Albion rising? Or is it coming from without Albion rising? And of course, it's coming actually from both. It's coming both from within and without. This is the center that is everywhere, the divine light, the ineffable light, and the darkness even that's the source of all light. And so Blake in this image is drawing us back into a perception of how that which is within is without, and triangulating it moreover to bear witness to the divine light as well. Just to think about Blake's supernatural awareness too, if supernature is even the right expression, his clairvoyance, you might say. I think this is one of the things that we've got to stay with in Blake. And one of the things I try and do in the book is not diagnose his ability to see angels and converse with the dead, as many fellow professionals in psychological or psychotherapeutic traditions have done. You know, he's often accused of having hyperphantasia, sort of flood of imagery. His art tried to corral discipline, and then of course you get someone else popping up and say, no, it wasn't hyperphantasia, it was aphantasia. He had no images, and so his art was a way of conjuring what his mind lacked. And people will cite temporal lobe epilepsy or even migraines. We've got to resist all that. Blake knew about a lot of that, actually. He wrote about craziness. He was accused of being crazy. And instead, I think, stay with what he might have seen more fully to challenge our worldview and take us some direction into that. I was recently on a panel with the Temenos Academy and Ben Okri, the poet, speaking. And he put it beautifully. He said, when I'm writing poetry, with one hand, I'm dowsing. I'm seeking a kind of clairvoyance. I'm seeking an inspiration or an intuition from a spirit that might be present. And then with the other hand, I'm writing it down in my poetry. I'm giving voice in another way to this. And thinking about how this clairvoyancy can be brought closer to us, how it might already be part of our experience in some way or other. And the way that I often think about this is in psychotherapy, we, in slightly grand ways, talk about the transference and the countertransference. You know, the feelings that we're having in someone's presence and trying to understand the feelings that they might be having in ours. But really, this is just saying that there's a kind of communication that's going on that's beyond the empirical senses. It might give birth to images. It might even give birth to auditions, certainly to less maybe well-defined feelings. But if you can stay with them and try and give them form and shape, much in the way that Blake said, you know, reason, he said, can give form and shape to energy. It can focus things. That's what discernment is about. Then you can be taken more fully into, if it's you sat with someone else, what might be going on in the room, but maybe more broadly in the world as well. I think, though, that this has also got to be kind of given a divine grounding. It's got to be rooted in the divine. And Blake, I think, does this as well. He does this partly to differentiate himself from what we now would call pantheism. I think he would feel that the idea that God and nature can be kind of equated is just to try and re-enchant the flatland that otherwise, you know, carries on existing. So it doesn't really liberate you, it doesn't really ground or give you an ontology. And one way of thinking about this, I think, is that the modern spiritual yearning, the consciousness soul, I think it's the kind of bearer of what you might call the apophatic tradition from the older mystical schools. So, you know, nowadays, spiritual teachers will often talk about turning in and seeking that part of you which is still. The awareness of awareness is sometimes described as, or how your reflections on being able to say, I am, that I-ness that you know is at once the divine I am. If you're, you know, reflecting on Western traditions. It's much like what the author of The Cloud of Unknowing says, actually, how everything goes into the cloud of forgetting so that you just sit before the cloud of unknowing with the love that reaches out into it. So there's that apophatic element which speaks to lots of people in this consciousness soul period. But I think Blake says we've got to bring that back into some kind of, well, not dialogue, well, a dialogue if it leads to a transformation, not an integration, but a transformation. With the cataphatic. In the Eastern traditions, it might be called the tantric, which is knowing the divine presence everywhere else as too, once it's kind of, you become more conscious of it within inside yourself. So Blake is at once, you might say, a mystic and a visionary. Sometimes in Blake studies, there's this dispute about whether Blake was a mystic and a visionary, because Northrop Frye said he wasn't a mystic, he was a visionary. Well, I think what Frye was doing there was sort of turning the volume down on Blake's sense of the divine, turning it up on the sense of symbolism and metaphor and nature and so on. But I think Blake's quite clearly both. He has both the keen sense of the God within, but also the God without. So, you know, when he writes some of his poetry, that comes out. He says, there's a moment in each day that Satan cannot find, nor can his watch fiends find it. So the narrowed imagination can't find it. But the industrious find this moment, and it multiply. And when it once is found, it renovates every moment of the day, if rightly placed. So these words from the Industrial Revolution, you know, it's the light side of the dark surrounding mills, the industry and the innovation. We're called to be active in this, and so to be visionaries as well as mystics. And then this moment that's in every day, we can find and place aright to renovate every moment of the day. He talks about this as seeing not with the senses, but through the senses. You know, you know more, he says, look at a window and think, what a beautiful pane of glass. No, you look through the window and what it transmits. And similarly, he talks about contraries, holding these opposites together, the polarities that Coleridge was so keenly onto as well, because the polarities, like the poles of a magnet, create a field. And if you can develop the capacity to constantly giving of yourself into this field, then life will be returned to you. And it's as foolish to say, you know, I want the good and not the bad, if you like, as it is to say, I only want the north pole of a magnet, so I'm going to cut it in half. You get two magnets if you do that. What we must learn is to enter the field once more. And then you get some of the sense of how phrases in Blake like, annihilate the selfhood in me, be thou all my life. It's about this giving of all that you have in order to receive back, which was always the source of what you had anyway, but somehow amplified or with a new kind of freedom. You know, Milton in his poem says, you know, I will give myself to eternal death and also to eternal life. And Blake puts it so beautifully when he talks about he who binds to himself the joy, does the winged life destroy? That kind of possessiveness, the grasping of the eyes that would seize and try and control through understanding. He who binds himself to the joy, does the winged life destroy? But he who kisses the joy as it flies, lives in eternity's sunrise. So that giving of all that you have, that embrace, that communion, which is also a kind of sacrifice. So to begin to draw to a bit of a close and hope, you know, bring some of these threads together. And actually, I might just say one more thing about this, which I think that there's something which is important here that I'm still struggling to try and find out, you know, how to articulate better. But just to return to the question of the identity politics of our times, Blake himself doesn't use the word androgynous, but Coleridge does use the word androgynous and talks about how the great mind is the androgynous mind. Doesn't say a whole lot more about it, so far as I know, but Virginia Woolf does. She picks it up, and in A Room of One's Own, she talks about the androgynous mind and how the ideal artist or creative's mind is the androgynous mind. Because she said what the androgynous mind has achieved is kind of burning away all the complaints, the struggles, the sufferings of life. But in that very act of engaging the suffering of life, becoming more porous or transparent to the whole of life. So this is a meeting of the particular individual, the particular identity that becomes porous to the universal. And, you know, the universal is always not to be confused with the general. The universal is the infinite expressed in the finite. It's the world in a grain of sand. And I feel like there's an intimation here of what we need now in this domain as well. Androgyny, not meaning an attempt, as it were, to collapse everything onto the biological, which Blake did have a word for, you know, if you'll forgive any sensitivities around it, but he called it the hermaphroditic, the attempt, as it were, to collapse the sense of who you are as an individual, but rather to move more and more into who you are as an individual, but in order not to secure your place, but to open yourself up to all places. And Blake has this too. It's why he loved Michelangelo in a lot of his imagery, and he loved nudity in a lot of his imagery. This was his way of trying to represent the one divine humanity of which we're all expressions of. And this is where identity is found, and particularly in the figure and person of Jesus, of course. So Jesus becomes the one humanity, and which is why Los and Jerusalem and so on are identified with Jesus in this. Now, Barfield thought that Blake, the love of Blake that is in the modern world, is because we sense a lot of this in Blake, even if we haven't quite developed the will and the freedom to articulate and so make it our own. Barfield actually thought that the love of the hymn Jerusalem, and did those feet in ancient time and so on, is because it's uniting in those words this older medieval intellectual experience of knowing your thoughts as the divine thought with the consciousness, awareness of its alienation and isolation, but yearning therefore to reach back more, inspiration combining with imagination. Because if you think about it, the first half of Jerusalem is almost like the lost soul questioning whether it's really lost. And then in the second half, it's the lost soul committing to a new discovery. So it's all questions in the first hand. And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountain green? And was the Holy Lamb of God on England pleasant pastures seen? And did the countenance shine forth upon our clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here amongst the dark satanic mills? And then, bring me my bow of burning gold. Bring me my arrows of desire. Bring me my spear, O clouds, unfold. Bring me my chariots of fire. I will not rest from mental fight. This is the active imagination. I will not cease. Nor shall my sword sleep in my hands, that discerning sword that can reach deliberately, willfully, with a new freedom back into things, till we build Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. So don't loathe that hymn if you do. Love it for what it might be awakening in people. Blake, of course, develops a lot of what speaks to people in terms of ecology now, a romantic ecology, but not just a pantheistic inclination, but one that might become rooted within epistemology, within ontology, because all things are speaking of the divine intelligence. And so we can know that when we reflect on nature, we're receiving the divine as well. It's not just a gesture that's going to rise or fall on the intensity of feeling. In a way, feelings get in the way, because it's a deeper intuition that Blake and others encourage us to embrace. I think we can return to the question of angels and how thoughts can become thinking once again, as Barfield put it very, very wonderfully. He noticed that in the modern world, we study, we examine, we have thoughts as if they're facts about things, but what gets lost is the living sense of a thinking that's an unfolding, that's a becoming, and that's aware of the dynamism in what we're contemplating as well. That's the trouble with a pure examination that's not a participation. And again, I think Blake would encourage us to put together what traditionally is known as naturata naturans, which is the nature naturing with the naturata, with the natura naturata, pardon me. So the natura naturans, the nature natured, the kind of facts of the natural world, which science is so good at getting a hold of, with the natura naturata, the becoming of nature, which the romantic imagery can help us to recover. But to put them together, to start to begin to become aware of the source of these things again, that triangulation. So Mother Nature might start to become not this thing that we kind of fear, matter becoming matter, this dead stuff that might consume us if we're not careful, if we don't manage it aright, but instead the life of Mother Nature, or the divine Logos, of course, becoming known to us once again and completely transforming our relationship, our communion with the natural world, therefore. If the calling on the imagination isn't enough, there is also this constant reminder in Blake that it demands all of us in order to know the all. Blake points out that more is the cry of a mistaken soul and the consumer way of life that feels it can accumulate and possess many things as if that might add up to the all. But Blake doesn't do the ascetic turn. He doesn't say, okay, turn down your desire. He says, no, understand your desire, because less than all cannot satisfy man, he says. And I think that all is only known when we give of the all and receive therefore back from the all. And then the furnaces of affliction become fountains of living water, as he puts it. It's the imagination as a leap of faith that can become a kind of transformation. But the promise is tremendous. If the ask is big, the promise is tremendous. A new consciousness, a new communion, a new awareness of the divine, a new recovery of ourselves. And I think, if the Romantic movement needs to come of age, as Barfield and others have spotted, if it's not to become this tragic force in our time, it needs to reconnect with its Platonic origins, you might say, not in a nostalgic way to go backwards, but to see clearly what's happening now, particularly in terms of the sense of self, the kind of freedom, the kind of willing that can be not just a choice, but can be a giving. And then, it might be remade anew. And I hope that amongst everything else that is reflected on here in terms of Platonism and what it can offer us, Blake, because of the brilliance of his poetry that gives you the promise even before you've understood it, you fall in love before you know quite what he's saying. And that is part of what he can contribute to our times today as well. So thanks very much.